I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Ben Lowsen, a China specialist focused on American strategic and national security policy. Ben is currently an Air Force China-strategist and an adjunct faculty member at National Intelligence University. Ben has a master's degree in East Asia Regional Studies from Harvard and a BA from UC Santa Barbara, along with degrees and certifications from Capital Normal University, the Command and General Staff College, Defense Language Institute, and the Joint Military Attaché School. So, Ben, welcome. Thank you for joining me today, sir.
Thank you very much.
Let me start out by asking just a little bit about your background, what your focus has been with regard to China, and what do you do for the Air Force and for National Intelligence University?
Super. Well, I started as a field artillery officer in the U.S. Army, and then I got selected to become a foreign area officer specializing in China. So I did my tour of study in China and here back in the States, and I went on to become an assistant army attaché in Beijing, which was a great experience. I retired from the Army after that, worked a year for the Navy before coming to my current job at the Air Force. What I work on at the Air Force primarily is air operations, and specifically looking at creative ways to apply air power to solve some of the pressing problems of our day. At National Intelligence University, I teach on U.S.-China strategic competition. And besides that, I do some writing for the Diplomat and on my own website at Lowsen.com.
Well, and again, I can't thank you enough for joining me. I mean, this is such an enormous area. There are so many different aspects of this, I guess, that are worth exploring. And all of this is incredibly timely and relevant in terms of foreign policy. So what I wanted to get into, I guess, in terms of headlines was there are protests that have been going on in China. I think that's the biggest headline right now. And from what I understand, these are due to China's severe COVID restrictions and kind of their authoritarian approach to enforcement. What can you tell me about this situation as it currently stands?
Well, there's a lot that goes into it, but I would probably start by saying that COVID was a huge crisis for the Chinese Communist Party and Xi JinPing in particular as the paramount leader. And he responded to it with what we might call in government terms maximum force. He threw everything he had at it in order to try and suppress it within his country, but also to try and suppress any bad news about China. And that led to actually a lot of malign activity around the world. But the reason he did this was because he saw COVID as a threat to his credibility. Coming in as leader, his main program was to try and stifle foreign influence and things like just the influence that comes in on capital and the sort of the freedom actually that comes in on that. So that's really a big task for a leader like Xi Jinping. And COVID threatened that. And so he went after it with everything he had. And really sort of the benchmark there was the party congress that happened last October, where he was essentially reelected. It's not really an election, but he was reelected for a third term, sort of breaking the norm that Deng Xiaoping had set. Deng Xiaoping was never paramount leader. He was the paramount leader. He was never the state chairman, but he set the norm of having two terms, and she broke that. And that really set a lot of people off, especially after 3 years under zero COVID. And so people saw that, and they saw that they were still under zero COVID. And we started to get stories like a bus accident in China where people being forced into a quarantine center, 30 of them died on a bus. And maybe that wouldn't be a big deal in normal times, but under these extreme conditions of Xi's zero COVID policy, it triggered something, and you could tell. And then the final spark was a building fire in China. China calls it Xinjiang Autonomous Region, where a bunch of folks died because they were locked in under these COVID lockdowns. And that was kind of the final spark that triggered these protests. Now, the remarkable thing since the protests has been that the government has completely turned around on its zero COVID policy. It's gone. COVID is running wild in China. Now, Xi's gotten his subsequent term at the party Congress already. So some folks think that Xi was just waiting until after the Congress to let it go. But it really did seem to come in response to the popular protests, which were against the party and Xi to a great extent. And also to businesses like Foxconn, especially, that put pressure on the government to release them. But now it looks like the ship of state is rudderless in a storm as COVID is raging out of control.
Well, so from what I understand, many of the people in China aren't aware of Tiananmen Square or the violent repercussions to that event, which to me means that they're probably not considering the consequences of protests, right? I mean, even in terms of COVID, I remember when COVID first hit, they were welding people into apartment blocks, or at least that was what I read in the mainstream media. And so what I'm wondering is if these protests might be setting the stage for some kind of draconian response later by the Chinese government. Now, it sounds like maybe it's almost gone the other way, where they've said, it appears that they're backing off their restrictions and saying, okay, you guys, you want more freedom, you can have more freedom, you'll have more COVID as well. That's kind of my takeaway from what you're saying. But I also do worry in terms of protests, just again, based on Tiananmen Square and, this heavy-handed response in the past. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the direct answer to the protests is that they've already been suppressed at some level. They only lasted about 2 days, and they sort of dispersed on their own or with moderate pressure from only the police forces, not the military, as they had to use at Tiananmen. And after that, they started going after some of the ringleaders of the protesters, or maybe more than that. As a general comment, I would say that China today is in a very extreme state of suppression. That's just ongoing. People understand that there's cameras watching them everywhere. They have their neighborhood and block committees watching them. And if they do something unfavorable or something against the government, that's going to percolate up. And so I would say the protesters in 1989 at Tiananmen might not have expected to be harangued the way they were, and they weren't for most of the protests until the very end. But the protesters today, they showed up on the street to oppose the party and Xi Jinping, knowing that there was going to be some great consequence. And in spite of that, they could not take zero COVID anymore. And I think that made it a lot more meaningful.
I see what you're saying. Well, another giant headline in the news that I think everyone has heard about is the Ukraine war. And so I wanted to ask what China's position is on this. From what I understand, they've been distancing themselves from Russia recently. I'm wondering if does that indicate kind of a growing schism between Moscow and Beijing in terms of political relations and military strategy?
I'm actually inclined to say no. I think that there's always been an inherent schism there, and it's always been some back and forth, even going back to the Sino-Soviet split. So today we saw in last February at the Winter Olympics, that Russia and China penned their no limits partnership. And I think this was very much Xi's doing. And the metaphor I use is taking your money to a casino and not going to the roulette table, not going to the blackjack table. The odds are pretty so-so, and actually going straight to the toilet and putting your money in the toilet, which is sort of what I think China is doing by placing this huge bet on Russia. So why are they doing it? I think it's because Xi feels cornered. He's basically tried to do away with Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening program. Now, he wants the money that comes in from a good economy, but the things he's done have worked very much to the detriment of that. And so he's looking for some place to put his money, and it can't be on reforming and opening. So where does he go? He has this sort of strategic partnership with Russia. And I think I wrote an article on this at the beginning of last year. There's been a lot of pushback, even within the party, on this relationship. It just looks very bad for China.
Yeah. Well, do you think that we could compare today's Moscow-Beijing relationship in any way to the World War II Berlin-Tokyo relationship? And the reason I ask that is, the Ukraine war is definitely, I don't want to use the word distraction, but the West's focus is on the Ukraine war right now. So, looking in World War II terms, do you think that China may use that while our focus is on Ukraine and and Europe? Do you think that they may use that for territorial expansion, much like the Japanese did during World War II?
I really do appreciate that as a point of comparison. And obviously, geographically, you have a major power facing westward and another major power facing eastward. I would point out in this partnership, unlike sort of Germany and Japan, that Putin is very much the junior partner here, the supplicant. He doesn't have the power, and I think we're seeing some of that from his debacle in Ukraine and the troubles he's having there. So I would almost compare him more to Mussolini. And, it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible war going on there. But there is, I don't want to make light of it, but there is a clownishness to the way that Putin is carrying that out. So I would just refer back to, you mentioned, I think, territorial expansion, possibly China looking for that. I would refer back to Biden's statements, comparing his statement on Ukraine to Taiwan. Ukraine, he was very clear, no boots on the ground. I personally disagreed with such a strong statement saying we weren't going to do anything on the ground there. But still, he said that. And in Taiwan, he's been very clear that we have a commitment to defend Taiwan. And I think if you look at our disposition of forces, yes, we put more forces in Europe, but strategically speaking, we're really trying to lean on the European Union to take care, do a lot of work on the Ukraine problem. And I think we're trying to keep open in case anything happens in the Pacific and to make sure it doesn't.
Well, yeah, and that was one of the things I was going to say next is, we have learned from history as well, right? I mean, so they can look back at, but so can we. And one of the things that we have looked at is, World War II and lessons that we can take away from that. So from what I understand, we've been strengthening our military presence in the Taiwan area over the last few years. And so, it does seem like we are more prepared, I guess, than ever before.
I think there is some of that element, and the lessons of history where you have a power in Asia that might be attempting to dominate. And I think, to your point, I might not say the Taiwan area exactly. I would probably say more like East Asia, or now we say the Indo-Pacific, because it's broader. It includes the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Even going back to the Obama administration's rebalance, trying to shift some of our strategic focus from the Mideast to the Indo-Pacific area. And the lesson I really take from World War II would be, I always call it the lesson of Munich, where you have a certain form of government, and I would call it totalitarian. It demands absolute obedience on the part of citizens, and it is willing and testing the limits of what is possible up to and including genocide. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing that with China again today. So I think the lesson for us is learn the regime type and respond accordingly. In this case, we have to respond with some toughness.
Well, I'd like to get into technology now, because another giant headline, this is something that I've done several podcasts about. Another giant headline has been the use of kamikaze drone aircraft by both sides in the Ukraine war. And it seems like drone warfare is changing the paradigm of modern warfare. And China just recently announced the development of a kamikaze drone as well. Is this something that you're familiar with? Can you tell me anything about China's involvement in this area?
A little bit. My primary area is security and strategy. So from that perspective, as opposed to maybe a technologist perspective, I would refer back to another guest that you interviewed previously, Eric Chan. He talked about in an article, The Game of Drones. I really appreciate that reference. I thought it was well put. First of all, I just say I think kamikaze and drone maybe aren't the best words to be using for this. In the end, you're talking about a missile, a flying object that's going to explode. Is it a missile? Is it an aircraft? Well, you don't necessarily have to decide. And again, drones, it can cover a range of things from remotely piloted vehicles to autonomous vehicles to anything in between. So just for the sake of specificity, I like to look at those aspects. Does this change the nature of warfare? I would refer back, from my Army days to Clausewitz saying, the character of warfare changes, not the nature. And so in this case, I think, yes, it is several aspects of the cutting edge of technology, including integrating AI capabilities. And from an air domain perspective, it provides greater maneuverability to the aircraft without having to have an air breather in there. So that is pushing the cutting edge of warfare, but I'm not quite sure we've gone to the Terminator level revolution yet. We're still looking for that.
Well, the reason I ask is right now, many of the drones that are used, at least in the Russian side of things, are manufactured in Iran, and they lack the scale and expertise of China's manufacturing industry. So if China begins mass producing an arsenal of weaponized drones, I'm wondering if that would make them more of a threat to the United States. And do you think that it might force us into this area of technology in order to maintain parity?
I would say that on the China side and on the US side and around the world, that's already happening. I think if you look at some of the key sources like the Department of Defense, US DoD, China Military Power Report, and China's military strategy, the white paper put out by China's State Council, you can see that they're already deep into drones or remotely piloted vehicles. We are as well. And so since that's already happening, we're moving this step by step, and you see a sort of, you can call it an arms race, I suppose. That's happening. Now, is this going to be more of a threat if it gets into the hands of smaller actors, smaller states? I think it can create problems, but I think the major threats are still going to be the great powers. Number one, the PRC, then Russia, Iran, North Korea, and after that we have terrorism, and that's what we're focusing on.
Well, and actually, that was my next question. I was going to ask if China begins developing these weaponized drones, the next thought is, given their manufacturing capabilities, if they begin exporting them, right? And and that raises this scary prospect of, what if these begin popping up in countries that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford these? The point that you made earlier about, is this a missile or is this a plane? The thing that I've been thinking, maybe this is incorrect, to me it almost seems like a poor man's cruise missile, and maybe that's not the best way to describe it, but that's just when you think about the capabilities and what it does and all of that, that seems like that's kind of the best fit. And I was like, so what if all of a sudden you have these smaller nations that there's no way they could afford a cruise missile, and all of a sudden they begin to have some of these capabilities, that.
Absolutely. I think you look at Russia's industrial capacity straining to meet its demand in the Ukraine war and having to rely on Iran, who, as you mentioned, is not necessarily the leading cutting edge production facility. Maybe you're seeing a little bit of that already. And I think Eric Chan pointed out that in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, these sorts of weapons were already being employed in 2020. Yeah. Sort of just like you're talking about. So yes, I do think it'll be a factor, especially among smaller states. I think really what that speaks to is our ability to keep a peaceful international environment. And I think you see peaceful places like the EU, and a lot of other places around the world that are generally peaceful, but then on the periphery, you're going to have squabbles like that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a little bit about Taiwan. The Washington Post has written that China considers Taiwan a breakaway state. I think most people are kind of familiar with that perspective by now. And of course, they have this long-term goal of reunifying it with the mainland government. Bloomberg has written that Xi Jinping wants to cement his legacy by regaining the lost territory. So has he made any recent moves to further this goal, or is this still kind of a long-term strategy? And do you think that I understand that they've pursued this by peaceful means. So do you think that they'll continue that, or do you think that they may resort to military action?
I would say it's yes to both Xi pursuing a long-term goal and to trying to make that goal happen in the near term as well. And what I mean is this. From his perspective, Xi Jinping's perspective, he's trying to finish the Chinese Civil War that kicked up again from 45 to 49, that the communists eventually basically won by taking the whole mainland. But they didn't entirely defeat their opponent because the nationalists fled to Taiwan, and that's how we get the democratic nation of Taiwan today, which in some sense, the question for Xi is, what's the urgency of doing this? I think in a lot of ways, is Taiwan going to decisively declare some form of independence? I think the answer is no. That's not very popular on Taiwan. They see themselves as already plenty independent, so it's just not a necessary step for them. From Xi's perspective, again, I would say that wanting is not having. So amphibious operations, as we know, are quite difficult. And in many ways, I don't think the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is ready to do this yet. And so if Xi tried to force it, it would be a very difficult thing. Taiwan, the government on Taiwan has warned that the price for Xi Jinping attempting an amphibious assault will go down in 2025. And they weren't really clear on why that was, but I would say the knowledge of that 2025 date is prompting us on the U.S. side, and especially for Taiwan, to do something to counter the potential for that invasion. And so it's the sort of back and forth like that.
Oh, okay. Okay. And so the 2025, I believe that I heard one reference to that. You were saying that there's a greater likelihood in that year then. Is that kind of?
No, I don't think in that year specifically, because that again, we're going back and forth, developing new capabilities and fielding them between Taiwan, U.S., Japan is building up now as well. You're seeing in the news, and yeah, it's going to be that's a very risky prospect for Xi, which is why I think he's doing something less than a shooting war, but more than simply putting pressure on Taiwan to unify, or as she would put it, reunify, although Taiwan has never been part of the PRC. And that means doing things like sending dredgers around islands in the Taiwan Strait. That means sending more aircraft and ships in the vicinity and doing electronic warfare and internet warfare. And as we saw with the Pelosi visit, they did the biggest exercise they've ever done to sort of express their displeasure with that, but also to try and change the baseline with the number of PRC ships operating in the vicinity of Taiwan. So if they ever did decide to invade, maybe they had an easier time of it. And if they didn't, well, from the PRC perspective, they're putting more pressure on Taiwan to let them know, hey, you need to unify with this.
Yeah. Well, the thing that makes this incredibly complicated is the trade relationships that are involved here. Right. The U.S. has nearly $100 billion a year in trade with the Republic of China, over $700 billion a year in trade with the Communist People's Republic of China. So if we continue trading with both countries, I can't help but wonder, what kind of trade damage would occur here if hostilities did flare, or if there was an embargo or sanctions or anything along those lines,
It would be extensive for sure. I would just note that much of this is happening now with the process of decoupling. So on the U.S. side, we're looking at China and its threatening, frankly, behavior, its military buildup, and the way that it's treating its neighbors, the way that it's acting towards our allies and partners. For example, sanctioning Australia severely for simply asking for an investigation into COVID. And we're also looking at the human rights abuses where China is committing genocide against, and a lot of people know them as the Uyghurs or the people in Xinjiang. I call them the people of East Turkestan. Problem is they're a separate nation entirely. They're not Chinese at all, never have been. And that's why she is trying to essentially wipe out that separate identity. So with that background, trade is becoming very, very difficult. If you're a company like McKinsey and you're supporting surveillance to fill China's concentration camps, that's just not acceptable from our government's perspective, and we're cracking down on that. So decoupling is happening. It would be an accelerated process in the event of a war, but we'd have to do things like friend sourcing. There's a new term that's coming out, trying to move our industry to friendly nations as opposed to a nation like the PRC that is using its money for military threats and genocide. And frankly, because of Xi Jinping's program to try and get rid of foreign influence, they're decoupling probably just as well as we are, if not better.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of goes off my questions list, but one of the things I'd heard was decoupling may go to Latin American nations as well, right? Like from what I understand, Ford and several other manufacturers already use NAFTA to manufacture in Mexico. And so they're able to pick up some economies of scale, and some dollar differences there that make things very attractive to move it to South America. It's also a heck of a lot closer, right? And potentially, and this was from a past interview, one of the people I talked to had said, if we do build up relationships there, that may help stabilize those economies, could reduce the drug trade, could suppress the cartels. So there may be a lot of benefits to keeping everything here in the Americas, or not everything, but at least some of these major manufacturing that we currently outsource to East Asia. So,
absolutely, those are fantastic points, and I definitely think so. Unfortunately, many people in the business community see China as a sort of a panacea or just a wonderful, wonderful investment, and it's very hard to get them to stop doing that. So we saw last year, 2 years ago, end of 2021, BlackRock was going great guns on China. We're going to invest in China. Now they backed off from that last year, but it's like there's this ancient Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who united them, and they thought at the time that mercury was a substance that would give you immortality. And I keep thinking that he died of mercury poisoning eventually, which is quite ironic. And I keep thinking that our industry is a lot like that, where they think China is this great panacea, but it's killing us, but they still want more of it. So I think it's up to Congress and up to our outstanding business leaders to do the right thing in this regard.
Yeah. Well, another thing that complicates this is like Taiwan's TSMC just issued an impact statement about a potential war between China and Taiwan. So they supply 48% of the global chip market. And Foxconn is the world's #1 electronics manufacturing service. So there are a lot of potential supply chain impacts that might happen, especially to our technology sector. Not only if hostilities, not like an actual shooting war, but even just anything like sanctions or, again, trade embargoes or anything like that. And one of the other things that I've found is in the case of TSMC, they're actually manufacturing, even though they're Taiwan Semiconductor, they're manufacturing a lot of their chips on the Chinese mainland. So again, these relationships are all very convoluted, right? And it makes sense that this is business. They do what works best from a business perspective. But then it seems like as the politics change, this just has the potential to unravel a lot of these relationships and potentially impact our technology sector a lot. Do you think that that's a real concern?
I do. And there's a lot of risk in the tech sector. So just going back to, will China invade Taiwan? I think the odds are still low. And I think Xi Jinping would have to be crazy to do so, but he may be crazy and he might do that. So I think there's just significant risk that is being undervalued in our business community. And I hope they do more to do that. I would just say if there's some sort of a blockade of Taiwan, I think that would be hard to keep up over a long time. Yeah. That's a very costly operation, not good. And I think we could probably get through that. And also, as far as finding emergency sources for some things, I don't know, it's hard. It goes back to rare earths, which the PRC has dominated, and I would say in a manner that is not legal under the World Trade Organization. Should never have done that, should never let them do that, but they did. And so going back even to those basic components and up the value chain to chips, we need to be creative. And I think one of the greatest strengths of democracy, capitalism, Republican governance is that we can be creative like that. We have the opportunity. So I hope we fire those cylinders up.
Well, yeah, and actually that for me, that's one of the really optimistic things is the CHIPS Act, right? And that's something where it seems like, American business as well as American policymakers, we've realized that, hey, we have a real vulnerability here, right? And whether or not things calm down or remain tense, there's still a vulnerability. And so the CHIPS Act helps bring home some of this technology manufacturing. And hopefully that provides a little bit more of a safety net for our technology supply chains. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you see that going well so far? And do you have a kind of a good feeling about that for the future?
Yeah, certainly. And the CHIPS Act, shoring up vulnerabilities in the supply chain is a great thing. And I think in general, just making sure that we maintain American competitiveness is a great thing. And the real question there is how much government intervention is too much. And I think it's very easy for the government to do too much. I think it's maybe slightly less easy, although certainly dangerous for the government to do too little as well. So it's finding that sweet spot. And I think that is where bipartisan agreement really comes in. And that's where the strength of our system really shines. Also, getting allies and partners on board is very important in this struggle, especially, and I think maybe we're talking about new ways new directions that we would go in with this. And would be looking at places like the Netherlands, and their chip production facilities that they still want to give some of the lower end things to the PRC or let the PRC use them, where, I don't know, we have to determine what the best way is there. We don't want to give these technologies over to a real systematic human rights abuser and a military threat. By the same token, we have to keep our European allies alive. And the Netherlands, and especially Germany, we're so dependent on the PRC. It's something we have to take into account, and we have to make real options together.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, Thank you so much for your time today. I genuinely can't thank you enough. It's wonderful being able to have you here and talk about what's currently going on with China and China policy. Let me close by asking what comes next for you? What are you going to be up to in 2023? And where do you see our relations with China going in the near future?
Well, let me first thank you, Tim, for having me on. This has been really great. I'm very happy where I'm at now, doing strategy for the U.S. Air Force and teaching at National Intelligence University. I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to keep writing for the Diplomat and working on my webpage. I would just say this is a pretty dark time for Xi Jinping and the PRC. They're going into what could be the greatest mass death event that they've experienced since the Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. And the PRC government is committing genocide right now. So I'm just going to keep pushing on my end to use some of that creativity, some of that freedom, and make sure that our government stays tough, that we stay smart, and that we stay true to our principles.
Wonderful. Ben, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Have a good day, Tim. Thank you.